The idea behind dialectical materialism is that the forces which move the world forward, which dictate history, human progress, are caused by the antagonisms which arise between different people's material conditions and class desires, or their what's that term? Their class interests. Thank you. There's a critical the idea here essentially is a rejection of the old idealists, who believed that the human condition, the human spirit, human society, whatever, advanced through a kind of ideological debate where you have concepts which are refined through antagonisms that arise in the conflict between different variants of an idea, right? But what Marx said was, actually, that's gay and stupid and dumb and bullshit, okay? In reality, ideas aren't what drive things forward. In reality, it's material conditions. People, societies even, aren't really motivated by ideas. And this is one of the reasons why I make the argument, for example, that poor countries tend to be a lot more reactionary. We see this all over the world. The wealthier a country is, the more likely they are to be progressive, Now, from an ideological perspective, from a like the ideological dialectic, right? This is, I think, sometimes a little bit difficult to explain because you have these ideas about progressivism that somehow just align perfectly along certain borders and levels of income. But it makes a lot of sense through a materialist philosophy because you can look at that and go, ah, I see. So progressive interests are more easy to develop upon when you're unconcerned with like the basic modes of existence. If you can provide for these things, equality becomes a more desirable goal. That very primitive or poor or underdeveloped societies don't concern themselves as much with equality because equality is second to survival. Once survival is taken for granted, fairness is something people care about a lot more. That's material, fundamentally. The idea there is that the evolution of a system is a product of material conditions right there, and you can explain that dialectically, as follows. Let's take America, for example. America was founded, nation, free for all, whatever, but there were slaves and women couldn't vote. Also, white people couldn't vote if they weren't property owners or women, whatever, nobody could vote, basically. Okay. So, now, some people argue, well, ideologically, we arrived at a dialectical resolution when we passed the Civil Rights Act, when we allowed women to vote, et cetera, because these conflicting ideas, they challenged one another, so on. But if you look at things, I disagree strongly. If you take a look, for example, at the abolition of slavery, one of the big things there is the core question: why was the South so inured with slavery when the North wasn't? And to me, the answer is economics. Okay, it's not because the North was more ideologically developed; it's because the South was less economically developed. They still relied on plantations and cotton picking. So to them, they had to come up with ideological justifications for the material state of things. Do you understand? They were dependent upon slavery, right? And so you can talk about the way in which women's rights and suffrage and feminism were advanced not just by people's ideas advancing, but also by World War I and World War II, where they would, send women off to the factories to replace the men who were sent off to the battle lines, right? And that created economic conditions. It's not that people's ideas move forward. It's that people are driven by their needs, material needs, and you fight for those needs. And when circumstances change, you might arrive at different conclusions. Take a look, for example, at the civil rights protests. Huh? Back in the 1960s, right? Did you guys know one of the biggest reasons why the American government capitulated and signed over the Civil Rights Act? One of the biggest reasons why they were willing to sort of make that concession to allow for that equality, to end separate but equal Jim Crow. It was because of the immense external pressure being caused by the Soviet Union. America was bearing a really, really, really bad international reputation at the time because we were having all these strong civil rights protests and injustice going on inside of the United States. And it was counter to the geopolitical interests of the United States, which were trying to convince a lot of these developing countries full of non-white people to stick with them instead of developing support for the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was using this for propaganda. If the US and Soviet Union are fighting over allegiances in a developing country full of non-white people, do you think the fact that America still has Jim Crow laws in effect make them look good? Now, Soviet Union had their own fucked up history, but sure, it's still good propaganda for them. The USSR can go, oh, you want to work under the Americans, do you? Look at how they treat their non-white people domestically. You think they'll treat you well abroad? Material conditions, okay? Not ideas. Not debate, really, but a procession and advancement of the things that drive people to act the way that they do. That's the critical distinction there. And I'm not a modernist. I don't think that, dialectical materialism can single-handedly explain all human behavior. But I think that it's a really, really good way of looking at things to understand a ton of history. How there are a ton of historical developments, ideological shifts, wars, revolutions, battles that you can explain not because people arrived at the revelation that these ideas had problems and that they should arrive at a better one, or these conclusions changed, but rather that just the power relations of different groups with different class interests shifted. That's a critical one. No, yeah, dialectical materialism doesn't refer to any actual debate. It refers to the antagonism between different groups with different material interests, like the strikes back during the beginning of the 20th century when there were massive labor movements. There was a conflict and antagonism between the material interests of the robber barons, the capitalist class, and the the striking miners, factory workers, textile workers, right? There are contradictions there. Because did I say 25th? I said 20th. I said 20th century. You guys are reaching. There's an antagonism there, and the things which resulted from those antagonisms, like for example labor laws, they were a product of a dialectical resolution of conflicting material forces. Does that make sense to everyone? Again, I'm not an expert on the theory stuff, but that's the gist of it, okay? That's the gist of it. And by the way, it's through historical materialism that I criticize countries like the USSR and Vietnam, okay? Because the different class interests of the proletariat and the bourgeois are reflected in the class interests of the citizen and the working people's party member, Even if you had a country with no capitalist factory owners, you could still have a country like the Soviet Union did, with party members and higher party members controlling, provisions of land, or, well, they didn't own the land, just like in Vietnam. There's no private property in Vietnam, Nobody owns the land. The government owns the land, and the government is controlled by a bureaucracy, and those people have a lot of power and a very different set of material interests to your average working Vietnamese person. Is antagonism physical action? Can also be discomfort. Antagonism simply means an inconsistency between the interests of two different groups from a materialist perspective. Doesn't have to result in physical conflict. There are plenty of antagonisms that don't actually lead to anything. They don't have to necessarily. It's just these are the fault lines along which earthquakes take place.
Every day when you're walking down the street, everybody that you meet has an original point